The sun hung low over the dusty fields of Millbrook County, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Jake Henderson wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned against his old red tractor, its engine finally silent after a long day of work. The harvest season was approaching, but the drought had been merciless this year. His crops were struggling, and so was he. Jake had inherited this farm from his father, and his father before him. 3 generations of Hendersons had worked this land, but Jake wondered if he would be the last. The bank notices had been piling up on his kitchen table, each one a reminder of how close he was to losing everything his family had built. At 32, Jake was strong and capable, his hands calloused from years of honest work. His neighbors respected him, and the local diner served him coffee with a smile every morning. But respect and kindness wouldn't pay the bills or save his farm. He needed a miracle, though he'd stopped believing in those long ago. The sound of a car engine struggling to turn over broke through his thoughts. Jake looked up to see a sleek black sedan parked on the side of the country road that bordered his property. The engine coughed and wheezed, but wouldn't start. Through the windshield, he could make out a figure frantically trying to get the car running. Jake's mother had raised him to be a gentleman, to help those in need regardless of his own troubles. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself away from the tractor and walked toward the road. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. As he approached, the driver's door opened, and out stepped a young woman unlike anyone Jake had ever seen in Millbrook County. She was probably in her mid-20s, with golden blonde hair that caught the afternoon light and skin that had never known a day of hard labor. Her dress was simple but elegant, the kind of thing that probably cost more than Jake made in a month. She held a phone in her manicured hand, waving it in the air as if trying to catch a signal. "Excuse me," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the quiet countryside. "Having some trouble?" The woman turned toward him, and Jake saw worry etched across her delicate features. Her eyes were blue, like summer sky, and they widened slightly as she took in his appearance. Jake was suddenly aware of his worn jeans, his dirt-stained shirt, and the way he must look to someone like her. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice carrying a hint of relief. "My car just died. I was driving through, and it started making this terrible noise, and now it won't start at all." She gestured helplessly at the sedan. Jake nodded slowly. "I'm Jake Henderson. I own the farm here." He pointed back toward his fields. "Let me take a look at your car. Maybe it's something simple." "I'm Madison," she said, offering him a grateful smile. "Madison Wells. I really appreciate this. I don't know anything about cars, and there's no self-service out here." Jake walked over to the sedan and popped the hood. The engine was still warm, and he could smell something burning. He studied the various components, his experienced eye quickly identifying the problem. The alternator belt had snapped, and the battery was dead. "Well, Madison," he said, straightening up. "Your alternator belt broke. That's why your car died. The good news is it's fixable. The bad news is you'll need a new belt, and the nearest auto parts store is about 20 miles away." Madison's face fell. "Oh no. I was supposed to be somewhere important today." She looked around at the empty countryside, as if hoping a solution would appear from the fields. Jake studied her for a moment. There was something about her that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. "Where were you heading, if you don't mind me asking?" "I was coming to visit some property my father owns around here," she said, her voice becoming quieter. "He's been talking about developing it, but I wanted to see it first. To understand what it really looks like." Something cold settled in Jake's stomach. "What kind of property?" Madison hesitated, as if sensing the change in his tone. "Farmland. He's a businessman, and he thinks the area has potential for commercial development. Shopping centers, maybe a housing development." The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. Wells. He'd heard that name before, in hushed conversations at the diner, in worried discussions with his neighbors. Richard Wells, the wealthy developer from the city who had been buying up struggling farms across the county. "Your father wouldn't happen to be Richard Wells, would it?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. Madison's cheeks flushed slightly. "Yes, he is. Do you know him?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. Richard Wells was the man who had been systematically purchasing failing farms, the man who represented everything Jake feared about the future of his community. Wells had made offers on Jake's farm twice, each time through lawyers and intermediaries. Jake had refused both times, but he knew Wells was patient. He could wait for the bank to foreclose. I know of him, Jake said finally. He's made quite an impression around here. Madison seemed to sense the tension in his voice. I know what you must think, she said softly. But I wanted to see this place for myself. To understand what my father is planning to change. Jake looked at her standing there in the fading light, suddenly seeming smaller and more vulnerable than when she'd first stepped out of her expensive car. Despite everything, despite who her father was, she was still just a person in need of help. Come on, he said, making a decision. Let me drive you to town to get that belt. We can have your car fixed and you can be on your way. Madison's eyes widened with surprise. You'd do that, even knowing who my father is. My mama raised me to help people in need, Jake said simply. That doesn't change based on who their daddy is. They drove to town in Jake's old pickup truck, the silence between them comfortable despite the circumstances. Madison seemed genuinely interested in the countryside they passed, asking questions about the crops and the challenges facing local farmers. Jake found himself explaining the drought, the economic pressures, and the difficulty of competing with large agricultural corporations. I had no idea, Madison said quietly as they returned with the new belt. I grew up in the city. I thought farming was just planting things and watching them grow. Jake installed the new belt as Madison watched, her designer dress somehow looking perfectly natural against the backdrop of his rural world. As he worked, she asked more questions, and Jake found himself talking about his family's history on the land, his struggles to keep the farm running, and his fears about the future. My father's offer, she said suddenly. He made you an offer for your farm, didn't he? Jake straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. Twice. I turned him down both times. Why? Jake looked out across his fields, where the last light of day was painting the struggling crops in shades of gold and amber. Because this land isn't just property to me. It's my family's legacy. It's where my grandfather taught my father to farm, where my father taught me. It's where I hope to teach my own children someday. Madison was quiet for a long moment. And now I'm not sure there's going to be a someday, Jake admitted. The drought, the bills, the pressure from the bank. Maybe your father is right. Maybe it's time to let go. Madison started her car, and the engine turned over smoothly. She should have thanked him and driven away, but instead she turned off the engine and stepped out again. Jake, she said, her voice determined. What if there was another way? What if instead of buying your farm, my father could help you save it? Jake shook his head. That's not how men like your father do business. Maybe it's time someone showed him a different way, Madison said. I saw something today, in your fields, in the way you talk about this place. This land isn't just dirt and crops. It's a way of life, a connection to something bigger than profit margins. Over the following weeks, Madison returned to Millbrook County several times. She spent hours with Jake, learning about farming, about the community, about the delicate balance between progress and preservation. She attended town meetings, spoke with other farmers, and slowly began to understand what her father's development plans would really mean. When she finally confronted Richard Wells, it was with a comprehensive proposal that would preserve the agricultural character of the county while still providing opportunities for economic growth. Instead of shopping centers and housing developments, she proposed agritourism, farmers markets, and sustainable development that would support the existing community rather than replace it. The conversation between father and daughter was difficult, but Madison's passion and newfound understanding eventually won over the businessman in Richard Wells. Perhaps it was seeing his daughter so engaged with something meaningful, or perhaps it was the realization that preservation could be as profitable as development, but he agreed to revise his plans. Jake's farm was saved, along with several others in the county. The Wells Foundation, as Madison insisted it be called, provided low-interest loans and agricultural support to struggling farmers. The development that eventually came to Millbrook County was careful and considerate, designed to complement the existing community rather than overwhelm it. On a warm evening 6 months later, Jake stood in his fields watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The drought had finally broken, and his crops were thriving. But more than that, he had found something he hadn't expected when he'd stopped to help a stranded motorist that dusty afternoon. Madison appeared beside him, her city clothes long since replaced by practical jeans and boots. She had moved to Millbrook County permanently, using her business degree to help coordinate the foundation's agricultural programs. "Beautiful evening," she said, slipping her hand into his. Jake squeezed her fingers gently. "Yes, it is," he agreed. "Yes, it is." In the distance, his old red tractor sat silently in the field, ready for another day of work. The land that had belonged to 3 generations of Hendersons would continue to flourish, now with the promise of a 4th generation to come. Sometimes, Jake reflected, miracles came in the most unexpected forms, wearing designer dresses and driving expensive cars that break down at just the right moment.